The 7 levels of Marvel Street level heroes. Level 1. Amateur. Hellcat. Long before the costume, she had lived a public life as a teen celebrity, and that history never fully disappeared once she put on the Hellcat identity. When she committed to fighting crime, the preparation itself was legitimate. Beast personally trained her, drilling her in structured hand-to-hand combat, conditioning, and tactical movement. That foundation mattered. It gave Patsy discipline, awareness, and survivability in situations that would overwhelm most amateurs. Her abilities added another layer. At different points, Hellcat demonstrated limited psionic resistance, heightened perception, and a tolerance to supernatural influence. Useful traits on the street, especially when facing occult-adjacent threats, but not powers that instantly tilted fights in her favor. In practice, her early street work exposed the gap between preparation and control. Patsy moved well, reacted quickly, and absorbed punishment better than expected, yet she rarely dictated how encounters unfolded. Street-level confrontations tested her judgment as much as her skill. She often entered situations with confidence, but without full command of pacing or escalation. Her wins felt earned through endurance rather than dominance. She survived because she adapted mid-fight, adjusted under pressure, and relied on training to escape bad positions. Criminals didn't fear her presence the way they feared higher-tier street enforcers. They challenged her, pushed her, and sometimes underestimated her. That made her early career a constant learning process. She showed the ingredients for growth, but at this stage, she was still reacting to the streets instead of shaping them. Scarlet Spider, Ben Reilly. You see, Ben Reilly and Kane Parker possess the same raw physical advantages as Spider-Man. Superhuman strength, enhanced agility, accelerated reflexes, wall crawling, and webbing. On paper, that should have placed them far above most street-level threats. In reality, operating locally exposed weaknesses that power couldn't cover. Ben Reilly's street work was shaped by identity instability. As a clone of Peter Parker, every patrol carried comparison and self-doubt. His decision-making reflected that tension. He hesitated at moments that demanded authority, second-guessed instincts, and allowed situations to linger longer than they should have. Street crime punished hesitation immediately. Ben could win fights, but he struggled to control them. Mistakes escalated because confidence lagged behind capability. The streets didn't care about potential. They responded to certainty. Kane Parker swung the opposite direction. Where Ben hesitated, Kane applied overwhelming force. His psychology drove him toward brutality, making him terrifying in close quarters. Criminals feared encounters with him, but fear alone failed to stabilize neighborhoods. Kane's approach escalated violence rather than containing it. His actions drew retaliation, attention, and collateral consequences that complicated street-level operations. Strength ended fights quickly, but it also invited cycles of escalation the streets couldn't absorb. Both versions of Scarlet Spider shared the same core issue at this level. Control lagged behind power. Without the restraint and responsibility that defined Peter Parker's approach, their patrols became reactive. They addressed immediate threats while unintentionally creating new problems. Local street work magnified emotional instability, turning each mistake into a larger ripple. Level 2. Skilled. Black Cat. She never entered the streets trying to clean them up. She arrived as a professional thief, someone who understood movement, timing, and escape long before she ever thought about heroics. That background shaped everything about how she operated. Black Cat approached street-level crime like a calculated exercise. She studied routes, measured risk, and treated every encounter as something to be managed rather than fought head-on. Her acrobatic ability placed her among the most agile figures operating in New York's underworld, and her hand-to-hand skills were refined enough to neutralize guards, criminals, and even costumed threats when conditions favored her. Her bad luck powers added an unpredictable edge. They didn't function like a switch she could flip at will, but when active, probability itself bent slightly in her favor. Weapons jammed, footing failed, plans unraveled. On the street, that made her dangerous in close, controlled encounters. Felicia rarely stayed long enough for situations to spiral. She struck quickly, disrupted balance, and vanished before momentum could turn against her. That approach made her difficult to catch and even harder to corner. What kept Black Cat in this tier was scale. She didn't hold territory or attempt to dismantle criminal systems. Her strength lay in manipulation rather than domination. Prolonged fights, large groups, or situations requiring sustained presence exposed the limits of her style. Felicia thrived in motion. When things slowed down or turned chaotic, she disengaged. The streets never feared her in the way they feared enforcers who stayed behind after the fight was over. They feared the uncertainty she left behind. That precision, combined with restraint, defined her effectiveness at this level. Elektra Nachios. Her training under stick and later involvement with the hand shaped her into a weapon rather than a vigilante. From the start, she moved with purpose. Every strike was deliberate, every step measured. Elektra didn't improvise in combat, she executed. Her mastery of martial arts, bladed weapons, and stealth placed her among the deadliest human combatants operating at street level. Where others learned through trial and error, she was forged through discipline and repetition. She understood anatomy, pressure points, and the psychology of fear. Street encounters ended quickly when she chose to engage. Criminals didn't test her the way they tested less lethal heroes. They fled, surrendered, or died. Her reputation traveled faster than she did, clearing paths before she even arrived. Yet that same precision limited her role on the streets. She operated as an assassin, not a protector. Sustained defense of neighborhoods, community presence, or long-term crime suppression never aligned with her mindset. Her loyalty conflicts, emotional volatility, and repeated deaths and resurrections hardened her methods further. She moved through the streets like a blade passing through fabric, leaving damage, not structure. Her effectiveness relied on isolation, one target, one objective. When drawn into broader conflicts, prolonged engagements, or morally complicated situations, her methods escalated consequences rather than containing them. The streets absorbed her presence as a shock, not a solution. She imposed fear but didn't maintain order. That distinction mattered. Black Widow. She didn't learn how to survive the streets by reacting to chaos. She learned by eliminating it before it formed. Her conditioning in the Red Room stripped away hesitation early, replacing instinct with discipline and emotional control. By the time she operated independently, street-level threats rarely felt spontaneous. Every movement, every engagement, and every escape was planned, several steps ahead. Natasha approached combat like a problem already solved, adjusting only when variables changed. Physically, she remained human. Peak conditioning, reflexes honed through years of training, and pain tolerance built through repetition defined her limits. That reality shaped how she fought. Black Widow avoided prolonged brawls, preferring to disable opponents through joint locks, nerve strikes, and environmental manipulation. She used weapons sparingly, often relying on timing and positioning rather than brute force. On the street, that efficiency mattered. Encounters ended quickly, quietly, and without spectacle. Her real advantage came before fights ever started. Natasha gathered information obsessively. She learned routines, weaknesses, alliances, and exit routes. Criminal operations unraveled because she understood how they functioned internally. Surveillance, infiltration, and misdirection allowed her to dismantle networks from the inside rather than confronting them head-on. Street crime collapsed around her without realizing who triggered the collapse. That invisibility made her effective, but it also limited her impact on public perception. Unlike vigilantes who became symbols, Black Widow remained unseen. Criminals feared consequences rather than her presence. When operations failed, leadership disappeared, or plans collapsed overnight, her involvement often went unnoticed. That approach kept casualties low but prevented lasting territorial control. The streets didn't reorganize themselves around her the way they did around enforcers who stayed behind. When engagements escalated beyond preparation, her lack of superhuman durability became a factor. Sustained combat against enhanced opponents forced her to disengage or rely on extraction. Natasha survived through judgment, not endurance. She knew when to withdraw and when staying would cost more than it achieved. That restraint defined her longevity. Level 3. Experienced. Iron Fist. Raised in Kunlun, after the death of his parents, Danny spent his formative years immersed in discipline, ritual, and combat philosophy. By the time he returned to New York, he wasn't learning how to fight, he was learning how to apply something ancient to a modern battlefield. The Iron Fist itself changed the equation. Channeling chi into a single strike gave Danny the ability to end fights instantly, shattering defenses that would stop almost anyone else operating at street level. That power shaped how criminals responded to him. Encounters didn't linger once the Iron Fist came into play. Gangs scattered, enforcers backed off, and word spread quickly that certain fights weren't worth taking. Yet the streets demanded more than finishing power. They demanded consistency, judgment, and restraint. Danny's inexperience with urban crime often showed. He approached situations with idealism that clashed with how street networks actually functioned. Decisions made in the heat of combat sometimes carried consequences that rippled beyond the immediate win. What defined him at this level was unpredictability. On his best nights, he controlled engagements with surgical precision, neutralizing threats before they escalated. On others, emotional turbulence disrupted his focus, weakening the discipline that made the Iron Fist effective. Street-level opponents learned to exploit that volatility, dragging fights out, forcing mistakes, or baiting him into collateral damage. Danny survived because his training was real and his power undeniable. Full command remained inconsistent. Still, experience hardened him. Losses, betrayals, and repeated exposure to organized crime sharpened his instincts. He learned to read situations faster, to recognize when force solved problems and when it multiplied them. The streets didn't break him, they tempered him. At this level, Iron Fist became less about raw chi and more about learning when to use it. Jessica Jones. Her powers arrived suddenly and violently, leaving her with superhuman strength and enhanced durability, but no roadmap for how to use them. Trauma shaped her early career more than training ever could. Encounters with Kilgrave fractured her relationship with heroism itself, pushing her toward isolation rather than patrol. When she returned to the streets, it wasn't as a vigilante looking for fights. It was as a private investigator drawn into them. Her presence on the street felt blunt and uncompromising. She didn't study martial forms or develop elaborate tactics. She absorbed punishment, closed distance, and ended fights through sheer force. That approach worked against low-level threats and desperate criminals who underestimated her. Doors came off hinges. Bodies hit pavement. Problems stopped moving. Her durability allowed her to stay standing where others would fall. Experience taught her limits. Strength solved immediate threats, but it didn't prevent situations from spiraling. Jessica learned to read people instead of battlefields, spotting danger through behavior rather than positioning. Investigations pulled her into confrontations where information mattered more than fists. She survived by adapting, not refining technique. Street crime didn't break her because she refused to let it define her. What placed her at this level was resilience. She stayed. Night after night, case after case, she absorbed the cost of street work without romanticizing it. Criminals didn't fear her reputation in the same way they feared masked symbols. They feared proximity. Getting close to Jessica Jones meant pain, embarrassment, and exposure. She didn't chase dominance. She endured. At this stage, experience mattered more than polish. Iron Fist and Jessica Jones had both learned the price of operating on the streets. They understood consequences, carried scars, and adapted through repetition. Neither fully controlled the chaos around them, but both had survived long enough to recognize it. That survival separated veterans from rookies and earned their place here. Level 4. Powerful. Moon Knight. Long before the mask, he had lived as a mercenary, learning how violence actually worked when rules disappeared. That background followed him into every encounter. Moon Knight didn't patrol in search of balance. He hunted threats and met them head-on. When Khonshu chose him as an avatar, that brutality gained weight. Enhanced strength, heightened resilience, and supernatural endurance turned close-quarters fights into psychological events. Criminals didn't just lose, they broke. Street-level encounters with Moon Knight rarely unfolded the same way twice. His multiple identities created unpredictability that worked in his favor. Opponents couldn't read him. Timing collapsed. Patterns disappeared. Some nights he fought with discipline and precision, dismantling operations piece by piece. Other nights, restraint vanished, and fights escalated into brutal spectacles that sent messages across entire neighborhoods. Fear spread faster than facts. Criminals adjusted routes, abandoned territory, and warned each other long before he arrived. That power came with instability. Mark's fractured psyche shaped how long his influence lasted in any given area. He dominated moments rather than maintaining structure. Streets quieted temporarily, then shifted elsewhere. Law enforcement and criminal networks struggled to anticipate his next move because he often couldn't either. Moon Knight didn't aim to control crime ecosystems. He disrupted them violently, leaving aftermaths others had to manage. At this level, his presence alone altered behavior. The streets learned to move differently when the white suit appeared. Luke Cage. Where others relied on speed, skill, or fear, Luke relied on inevitability. His bulletproof skin and superhuman strength removed hesitation from confrontations. Guns stopped mattering, knives lost relevance. Criminals discovered quickly that escalation failed against someone who couldn't be hurt. Encounters that would spiral for other heroes ended abruptly when bullets bounced and punches landed with unstoppable force. Harlem wasn't just a backdrop for Luke, it was territory. His role went beyond stopping crimes in progress. He became a constant presence, someone criminals had to account for before making a move. Dealers relocated. Enforcers avoided certain blocks. Violence adapted rather than disappeared. Luke didn't chase criminals across rooftops. He waited for them to make mistakes. Street justice became slower, heavier, and unavoidable. That durability shaped how conflicts unfolded. Luke absorbed punishment while others panicked. He closed distance without fear, dismantling threats through strength and patience. Yet his limitations surfaced just as clearly. Speed, range, and mobility mattered in prolonged engagements. Coordinated enemies learned to avoid direct confrontation, using numbers, distance, or manipulation instead. Luke held ground better than he chased it. What separated him at this level was symbolism. Luke Cage represented resistance that couldn't be intimidated. Communities trusted him because he stayed visible. He didn't disappear into shadows or strike once and vanish. He remained. That consistency stabilized streets temporarily, even when deeper systems remained intact. Harlem knew where its protector stood, and so did everyone else. Level 5. Elite. Daredevil. Hell's Kitchen didn't become dangerous because of Daredevil. It became dangerous because criminals knew he was there. Matt Murdock's presence reshaped how street crime operated block by block. His enhanced senses changed close-quarters combat into something almost unfair. Sound, vibration, heartbeats, footsteps through walls. Information arrived faster than most opponents could think. Fights ended before they truly began because Matt already knew where they would go. That advantage came with discipline. Years under stick turned instinct into structure. Daredevil fought economically, conserving energy, controlling distance, and forcing mistakes. He absorbed punishment others couldn't survive, not through durability, but through endurance and pain tolerance built over time. Every night demanded a cost, and Matt paid it repeatedly. Bruises accumulated, bones broke. He kept going anyway. Criminals learned that wearing him down rarely worked. He always came back. What elevated him beyond other street defenders was control. He didn't chase chaos, he contained it. Hell's Kitchen functioned as a battleground he understood intimately. Alleyways, rooftops, stairwells, terrain became a weapon. His legal work deepened that understanding. Matt knew how crime networks survived, how intimidation spread, and where pressure actually mattered. Fights were part of a larger strategy, not the end goal. Reputation followed. Whispers replaced bravado. Criminals avoided operating at night, altered routes, and abandoned plans that drew attention. Daredevil's presence created hesitation, and hesitation saved lives. He didn't dominate through fear alone, he enforced consequences with consistency. At this level, mastery wasn't about overwhelming power. It was about precision, stamina, and control applied night after night until the streets adapted. The Punisher. Where Daredevil imposed order, the Punisher imposed finality. Frank's military background shaped everything about how he operated. Surveillance, planning, ambush, and overwhelming force defined his approach. He studied targets patiently, waiting for moments when resistance collapsed instantly. Gunfights ended before they spread. Criminal organizations lost leadership overnight. Fear traveled ahead of him faster than any rumor. The skull wasn't a warning, it was confirmation. Once Castle arrived, escape options vanished. He didn't negotiate, intimidate, or incapacitate. He removed threats permanently. That certainty broke criminal morale in ways no vigilante ever had. Networks dissolved preemptively, members disappeared, and entire operations shut down rather than risk attention. His effectiveness came from restraint of a different kind. He chose targets deliberately. Collateral damage mattered, not because of law or morality, but because inefficiency compromised missions. Every engagement served a purpose. Weapons were tools, not statements. Firepower compensated for lack of superhuman ability, and preparation compensated for everything else. Street-level threats that overwhelmed others became manageable through planning alone. That approach carried consequences. The streets didn't stabilize after Castle passed through. They emptied. Power vacuums formed. Violence shifted elsewhere. Law enforcement escalated responses. Frank accepted those outcomes without hesitation. His role was eradication. Criminals didn't fear capture when the Punisher operated. They feared disappearance. Level 6, a crossover. Cloak and Dagger. When Cloak and Dagger appeared on the streets, geography stopped behaving normally. Tyrone Johnson moved through neighborhoods in ways normal streets weren't built to handle. The Dark Force turned alleyways into gateways, rooftops into shortcuts, and danger into something that could vanish in an instant. Criminals learned quickly that running no longer meant escape. One misstep and the street itself swallowed them. Cloak's power wasn't loud, but it was absolute. He controlled space in ways no street-level enforcer ever could. Tandy Bowen brought the counterweight. Light Force constructs cut through darkness with precision, creating blades, bursts, and barriers that struck fast and clean. Where Cloak removed threats, Dagger exposed them. Her energy didn't just injure, it revealed weakness, addiction, and intent. Street encounters involving the two rarely escalated. They ended abruptly. Plans collapsed before they could unfold. Operations failed without understanding why. Their effectiveness came from balance. Cloak's darkness demanded Light Force to stabilize him. Dagger's power burned brightest when anchored by Tyrone's control. Emotion shaped their success as much as ability. When they operated in sync, the streets bent instantly. When instability crept in, consequences multiplied. Their bond wasn't symbolic, it was functional. Criminal networks never fully adjusted because the rules changed every time they appeared. What kept them grounded at street level was choice. Their abilities reached beyond local crime, brushing against dimensions and forces far removed from neighborhood disputes. Yet, they returned repeatedly to small-scale battles, choosing intervention over dominance. That restraint mattered. They didn't occupy territory or impose authority. They intervened, corrected, and vanished. The streets adapted through avoidance rather than submission. Blade. Long before most street heroes encountered supernatural threats, Blade lived among them. As a daywalker, he combined vampire physiology with human will. Superhuman strength, speed, heightened senses, and accelerated healing gave him an edge few could challenge directly. Firearms, blades, and tactics refined through decades of combat turned that edge into certainty. Encounters with Blade ended decisively because he allowed no room for escalation. Street-level criminals rarely understood what they were dealing with until it was over. Blade operated primarily at night, where his advantages multiplied. multiplied. Darkness concealed movement. Fear slowed reactions. Supernatural enemies learned that their usual advantages meant nothing. Blade hunted monsters who believed themselves untouchable. That reputation filtered downward. Criminals learned to avoid spaces rumored to attract his attention. Entire underground networks shifted behavior without ever seeing him. His discipline defined his effectiveness. Blade didn't patrol aimlessly or respond emotionally. He targeted specific threats, dismantling them methodically. Weapons were chosen for function, not intimidation. Fights ended fast. Survivors didn't spread stories because survival itself was rare. That efficiency kept collateral damage low while maintaining pressure on hidden enemies operating beneath street crime. He remained separate from traditional hero communities. His war existed parallel to theirs. Vampires, cults, and occult factions thrived in the cracks others ignored. Blade sealed those cracks through persistence rather than spectacle. He didn't reshape neighborhoods through visibility. He cleaned them through absence. When supernatural crime vanished from an area, Blade had already moved on. Level 7. GOAT. Spider-Man. New York learned early that Spider-Man could have left the streets behind at any point. From the moment his powers settled in, Peter Parker operated on a scale far beyond muggings and alleyway crime. Superhuman strength, reflexes, agility, and spider sense placed him in battles with gods, aliens, and world-ending threats. Yet night after night, he returned to fire escapes, rooftops, and street corners. That choice shaped everything about his legend. Street-level crime never overwhelmed Spider-Man because he refused to let it escalate. His spider sense gave him awareness before danger formed. Crimes ended mid-motion. Guns were webbed before fingers tightened. Fights resolved without bodies piling up. Peter held back constantly, regulating his strength with discipline learned through loss. Criminals misjudged him because of the jokes, the movement, the speed. They learned too late that restraint, not limitation, governed his actions. What separated Spider-Man at this level was responsibility applied daily. He didn't patrol out of habit. He did it because no one else would do it with the same care. He saved people who would never know his name. He stopped crimes that would never make headlines. Neighborhoods adapted to his presence without needing fear. Kids waved. Criminals rerouted. Police learned where trouble disappeared fastest. Even when pulled into Avengers-level conflicts, Peter always returned. Bills, relationships, exhaustion, and injury followed him into the mask. None of it changed the routine. The streets weren't a phase. They were the foundation. Spider-Man's legend grew because he never treated small crimes as beneath him. He treated them as the point. Captain America. Before the serum, he was already fighting bullies in Brooklyn alleys. After it, the scale changed, but the instinct didn't. Enhanced strength, speed, endurance, and tactical brilliance made him a battlefield leader capable of commanding gods and soldiers alike. Yet, his moral compass remained fixed on the ground level. Street-level encounters with Captain America unfolded differently. He didn't dominate through fear or unpredictability. He controlled space through presence. The shield shaped everything. Defense came first. Civilians stayed protected. Criminals lost footing, momentum, and coordination. Fights ended cleanly, often without lethal force. Steve enforced order through clarity. People understood what he stood for immediately. His leadership extended beyond combat. Steve read environments quickly, understanding how panic spread and where it needed to stop. On the streets, that mattered as much as strength. He de-escalated situations through authority earned, not demanded. Criminals hesitated. Bystanders trusted him instinctively. That trust stabilized chaos faster than intimidation ever could. What placed Steve at this level wasn't power. It was consistency. He returned to street-level threats repeatedly, even when larger wars waited. He intervened personally when communities were threatened. He didn't outsource protection. The shield showed up where it mattered most. His presence reminded people that someone was willing to stand between them and danger without hesitation. And that's it. Now to you, who do you think leaves the bigger mark on a city? The hero criminals fear, or the one the neighborhood learns to rely on? Share your thoughts in the comments section below, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more amazing videos like this one.